In 2024, a billionaire fell from a cliff while hiking with his son. What an awful freak accident, people thought, until months later. Investigators reopened the case and started looking at the son as the main suspect.
Now to a stunning development in the death of a billionaire fashion tycoon. His son has now been arrested after his father's deadly fall from a cliff. Isak Ondich founded the international retail chain Mango with nearly 3,000 stores around the world. He died in 2024 while hiking with his son in Spain.
This is just one of those crazy stories I couldn't help myself but cover, because how are you gifted with such an amazing spawn point and still completely goof it up and destroy your life? I don't know, but I guess we'll find out in today's video. But this whole story starts out back in 1984. Isak Ondich and his brother opened the first Mango store in Barcelona. And over the next 4 decades, that single shop grew into one of the biggest fashion retailers in the world. And by the time of his passing, Mango had nearly 3,000 stores across more than 120 countries, generated billions of annual revenue, and made Isak one of the richest people in Spain. Not bad for a guy who moved from Turkey to Spain as a teenager and started off selling clothing. And at the time of his passing in December of 2024, Forbes estimated Isak's net worth at around $4.5 billion. And unlike a lot of the billionaire founders who eventually step away from the company they built, Isak was still heavily involved in Mango, and his children were involved as well, especially his oldest son, Jonathan. You see, Jonathan actually joined the family business years earlier and worked his way into a leadership role. He oversaw Mango Men, the company's menswear division. He sat on the board, and he was also one of the people who would help lead the company into its next chapter, which makes what happened next even more shocking. Because on December 14, 2024, Isak was on a hike out in the mountains outside of Barcelona with his son Jonathan. And according to the version of events everyone initially accepted, it was supposed to be nothing more than a family outing that ended in a terrible accident. This hike took place in the Montserrat mountain range, one of the most famous natural landmarks in Spain. And it's kind of a place that attracts tourists and families looking to spend a day outdoors. And that's one of the reasons this case immediately stood out. Because when you hear that a billionaire fell more than 300 feet, you're probably imagining some extreme mountaineering expedition. But no. Instead, reports say that Isak and Jonathan were walking along Les Freixades, a trail that's popular with visitors and used regularly by families. And authorities would later describe this as not being a very dangerous trail, and according to Jonathan's account, the two were hiking together when he was walking slightly ahead of his father. He later told investigators that he heard the sound of falling rocks behind them, and when he turned around, he saw his father falling off the edge. Isak then plunged more than 320 feet into a ravine near the Quibado Caves, and emergency responders were called to the scene, but there was nothing they could do. So now you have a 71-year-old billionaire who spent the last few decades building one of Europe's largest fashion companies now losing his life. And the news obviously sent shockwaves through Spain's business community. Politicians, executives, the fashion industry leaders paid tribute. Mango released a statement mourning its founder, and the company suddenly found himself planning its future without the man who built it. Meanwhile, investigators began looking into what actually happened on this mountain. And at first, the answers seemed pretty straightforward. A tragic accident. At least, that's what everyone thought. So in the weeks that followed, investigators examined the scene and came to a conclusion they had no indication that a crime had happened. And the case was treated as an accident and eventually was closed. And honestly, that kind of made sense to most people. Hiking accidents do happen, not often, thankfully, but unfortunately, they do happen. A misstep, losing footing, a moment of bad luck, and suddenly a normal day turns into an absolute tragedy. Regardless though, Mango kept operating. The company didn't collapse into chaos or spent months fighting over control. Instead, it just continued expanding around the world. New stores opened, sales continued growing, and the leadership kept expanding. And Jonathan's role in the company actually increased after his father's passing. He became the vice chairman of Mango's board, while his sisters also took on a larger position within the family holding company. So essentially, on the surface, everything appeared to be following the succession plan you'd expect after, the passing of a billionaire founder. And for months, the story just completely faded out of the headlines until something changed. Because in March of 2025, authorities quietly reopened the investigation. And this is where things start getting a little strange, because police haven't publicly explained exactly what caused them to take another look at the case. At first, the reports were pretty vague, and article after article would mention inconsistencies in Jonathan's statements, but nobody seemed willing or able to explain exactly what those inconsistencies were. And that's because the case was apparently under a court-ordered secrecy order. So in investigators were not publicly laying out their evidence. According to Spanish media reports, investigators believe the physical evidence at the scene didn't fully match Jonathan's version of events, and exactly what they found hasn't been publicly disclosed, but it was apparently enough to, I guess, get the authorities to stop treating Jonathan as just a witness. Then on top of everything, reports surfaced that Jonathan had visited the same hiking trail in the days before his father's passing, and depending on the source, that was either one visit or multiple visits. But I guess being on your own visiting a hiking trail before a tragedy, that doesn't mean too much. I guess plenty of people just go the same routes. But plenty of murderers do also scout the place where they're going to commit the crime. So I don't know. It could mean something. It could not mean anything at all. Who knows? But as the months went on, Jonathan's status reportedly changed from being a witness to a suspect, and authorities began examining additional evidence, including the contents of his phone. And that's where investigators reportedly found something that, at least in their view, could explain why someone might have wanted their billionaire father dead. A possible motive. So now, whenever investigators start talking about a motive in a case involving a billionaire, you can probably guess where the conversation is headed. Money.
Now, a judge says there is sufficient evidence to consider Jonathan criminally responsible. A court order cites a possible motive, the father's intention to start a foundation and reduce his inheritance. It says investigators found Jonathan visited the exact location of the fall 3 times in the days before the event, and says Jonathan's cell phone disappeared under unusual circumstances on a 2-day trip to Ecuador after the investigation was opened.
So investigators believe there may be some concern within the Andic family about Isaac's future plans with his fortune. Specifically, the report states that Isaac had been considering the creation of a foundation, which, creating a charity foundation as well could have reduced the amount of wealth eventually passed down through inheritance. And to be clear, this is 100% an investigative theory, not a proven fact. And it's definitely worth remembering that wealthy families create foundations all the time for a whole variety of reasons. But it's obviously a potential motive if true, or even if Isaac's family thought it might be true. Because I feel like the whole, oh no, dad's cutting us out of our inheritance, that could be like any movie plot or something like that. But there is a real chance that this is causing some family tension here. And apparently that wasn't even the only thing that reportedly raised questions here, because Jonathan's cell phone later disappeared during a trip to Ecuador after the investigation had already began. And it is a little bit convenient that suddenly officers need to search through your phone and you're like, oh, sorry, I lost it in Ecuador. My bad. And again, remember, this whole investigation was already closed originally. So now authorities were reportedly looking at an inheritance concern, prior visits to the scene, cell phone service, cell phone evidence, and apparently some stuff that wasn't lining up in Jonathan's account. So essentially the case went from a tragic fall on a family hike to something way more serious. And eventually, investigators decided that they'd had enough and they wanted to take the next step. So on May 19th, 2026, nearly a year and a half after Isaac Andic's death, police arrested Jonathan Andic. So the son who had reported his father's fall, attended his funeral, and stepped into the larger leadership role at Mango, was now being escorted into court by police. And authorities questioned Jonathan before bringing him before a judge in Martorell, the city overseeing the investigation. And court officials also confirmed that he was being investigated as a homicide. The judge also ultimately allowed Jonathan's release, but not without massive restrictions. His bail was set at €1 million. And on top of that, his passport was confiscated and he was ordered to appear before a court on a regular basis while the investigation continues. But meanwhile, the Andic family stood firmly behind him. In statements released through the family representatives, they say that they were fully cooperating with authorities and remain confident that Jonathan's innocence would be proven. And that's where this story becomes very unusually difficult to read, because despite the arrest, many of the key details are still hidden from the public. So the court proceedings, they've been largely sealed, and investigators have not publicly laid out their evidence. In fact, most of what I'm detailing here are allegations from the investigators. But again, these are allegations. We don't have any public accessible proof they have right now. Right now, it's investigators saying they believe there was a motive and they believe certain things are suspicious, and they believe those things justify continuing the case. That said though, if, and very important here, if someone genuinely believed that we're going to lose out on a multi-billion-dollar inheritance, I don't think it's too hard to imagine that could create some family tension. We're not talking about someone arguing over grandma's antique lamp here. We're talking about a fortune Forbes is estimated at roughly $4.5 billion. Money has a funny way of making people do some crazy things, which we've honestly covered on this channel quite extensively. Every criminal case that we've covered here on this channel, it's there because essentially someone looked at a situation, they went, you know what would really solve this problem? A felony, until it didn't. And then now they have to live with their own consequences. But I mean, here's the part that makes me hesitate before even jumping to conclusions, because Jonathan isn't the only child in the family. He has sisters, other heirs, and other people whose interests would probably be affected by the same decisions, at least publicly. And at least publicly, the family has been standing behind him and insisting that he's innocent. Now, does that mean they know something that investigators don't? Who knows? Does it mean that they're convinced the allegations are wrong? Again, maybe. Who knows? Or does it simply mean that when your brother is accused of killing your father, you're going to support him unless someone shows you a very compelling reason not to? Again, hard to know. But because everything is sealed, it's so hard to read from the outside. Like, we can see the accusations and we can see the arrest, but we can't see the evidence that's supposedly sitting behind all of this. And until all of that becomes public, we're just kind of sitting here with a whole bunch of questions, which brings us to where the case stands today. So Jonathan Andick is not being convicted of anything. He has been released on bail, and his family continues to maintain his innocence, and the investigation is still working its way through the Spanish court system. In a lot of high-profile cases, by the time an arrest happens, like, prosecutors are holding press conferences, laying out timelines, and showing everyone why they think they have the right person. But here, I mean, it's pretty much the opposite. Like, the public knows the investigators are concerned enough to reopen the closed case. And we also know that they reportedly questioned Jonathan's versions of events. And we also know they looked into a possible financial motive. But many of the details that would normally answer everyone's questions are still sealed. So depending on which article you read, this is either a homicide investigation closing in on a suspect or a tragic accident that investigators have spent months trying and so far, I guess, failing to disprove. And if investigators are right, then one of Spain's richest businessmen may not have passed away in an accident after all. But of course, if they're wrong, then a man who says he watched his father fall to his death, he just spent like the whole last year and a half under suspicion for something he didn't do and was most likely extremely traumatized from. But for now, the court appears to believe that there's enough evidence to keep the case moving forward. Whether the evidence ultimately holds up is a question in itself. So as of today, the founder of a global fashion empire is gone. His son is out on €1 million bail, and the mystery surrounding what happened on that hiking trail outside of Barcelona is far from over. But there's actually one more allegation investigators are reportedly relying on. So here you have court documents referencing text messages that investigators say showed Jonathan had what they described as an obsession with money.
Police ruled this death an accident, but now more than a year later, a judge says there is sufficient evidence that his son could be responsible, including text messages that show he had an obsession with money. The billionaire's son is now a suspect. Jonathan Andick is accused of planning the death of his father, Isaac Andick, founder of fashion retail chain Mango.
But I mean, if being obsessed with money was enough to get someone arrested, I feel like half of the financial industry over in Spain would be arrested. Still, investigators apparently believe these messages help support their theory about inheritance concerns and a possible financial motive. But the problem is that the public is mostly being asked to take their word for it, and the messages haven't been released because right now, we know investigators think the messages are important. We just don't know exactly why. And I guess the strangest part about the entire story is after everything, we're still left with the same basic question: what happened in December of 2024? Because if what investigators are saying is true happened on that mountain, the son is 45 years old, and he's currently facing 15 to 25 years in Spanish prison if he's actually convicted for this. And since they're alleging that he did this to his father, apparently under Spanish law, that automatically makes it aggravated, which pushes the sentence to the top end of the range. So if he gets 25 years in prison, I mean, that could be life in prison for him. So if what investigators are saying is true, he played himself. He allegedly wanted the inheritance, but instead now has no father and might sit in a concrete box for potentially the rest of his life, or at least a majority of the rest of his life. But as of right now, all we can really do is speculate because they haven't unsealed the documents. Well, when they do, I'll make an update video. So other than that, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.